the unbearable silence of being forgotten. There's a kind of death that no one talks about. It doesn't happen in hospitals, and it doesn't involve a final heartbeat. It happens in silence in the corners of a forgotten house, in a nursing home where the door stays shut, in the long, slow decay of being erased by your own children. The people you once carried, fed, loved, protected. The people you gave your youth for. They don't hate you. They just don't call. They don't visit. They don't look back. For many elderly parents, the most painful part of growing old is not the loss of health or strength or independence. It's the loss of meaning, of mattering to someone, of being seen. There are mothers who stare at their phones long into the night, hoping for a ring that never comes. Fathers who sit in wheelchairs watching the seasons change outside, but no one ever steps inside. And they begin to ask not out loud, because dignity dies quietly. What did I do wrong? But here's the hardest truth. Sometimes, the abandonment of the elderly is not about what they did in old age. It's about what they didn't do decades earlier. Not intentionally, not with cruelty, but with ignorance, with silence, with emotional absence. And now, the cycle completes itself not with violence, but with distance, not with hatred, but with forgetfulness. This video isn't about blame. It's about understanding. Because the question, why do some children abandon their aging parents, cannot be answered with shallow morality. We have to look deeper into the buried traumas, the silent generational contracts, the psychological mechanisms that turn a child's cry into an adult's withdrawal. We will explore, together, 7 core psychological reasons why this tragic fracture occurs. And then, in the final chapter, we'll search for a way back. For those who feel abandoned, for those who walked away, and for those standing in between, still unsure what love looks like when the years have buried so much under so little. If this pain belongs to you, you are not alone, and you are not beyond healing. The hidden wounds of childhood never heal. Some people don't walk away from their parents out of hate. They walk away because the pain is too old, too deep, and too quiet to explain. It's the kind of pain that was never spoken aloud, only swallowed. 1,000 moments that no one thought mattered. The sigh when you asked for help, the eye roll when you cried, the silence after an achievement. Not violence, not abuse, just absence. Just the cold space where warmth should have been. Children don't forget how it felt to be emotionally invisible. They don't forget when love came with conditions, when affection felt earned, not given. And when these children grow up, they carry that emptiness into adulthood. They don't scream. They don't confront. They simply disappear. They build lives that their parents are not invited into, not as punishment, but as protection. Because going back would mean re-entering a house that once felt like a cage. Psychoanalyst Melanie Klein spoke of internalized objects, how early relationships form the blueprint for all future emotional bonds. If your first experience of attachment is mixed with confusion, shame, or emotional starvation, your nervous system learns to survive without closeness. It becomes easier to avoid than to reconnect. And when your parent, now old and vulnerable, suddenly wants closeness, it can feel disorienting, even threatening, because they are not just a parent anymore. They are the embodiment of everything unresolved inside you. In Jungian terms, this is the return of the shadow. The parts of you that were never allowed to exist in that childhood home, the sadness, the anger, the longing, come back as distance. You're not being cold. You're being protective. You're not abandoning them. You're shielding yourself from the version of them you still remember. But the tragedy is this: while the parent may have changed, grown, softened, regretted, the version of them living in your psyche hasn't. And if that memory was never questioned, never brought into the light, it becomes a wall, not a boundary, a fortress. This is not to say all abandonment is justified. It isn't. But it is to say that understanding it requires more than moral judgment. It requires emotional archaeology. You must dig carefully through the layers of your past to understand why you feel safer far away. And for the elderly parent, confused, hurt, aching, this is the hardest part to grasp. That your child's absence may not be a reaction to your present, but a response to their past. A past you may not even remember. So before we ask, why did they leave me? Perhaps we must ask, where was the break? When was the wound made? And what was never healed? The silent rebellion against authoritarian parenting. Not every child who disappears from their parent's life does so in anger. Some vanish quietly. Not with a scream, but with a subtle closing of the door. Not with accusation, but with distance. It is not loud. It is not cruel. But it is final. And often, it begins in households that looked perfect from the outside. Neat. Disciplined. Structured. The kind of homes where rules were clear, expectations were high, and good children obeyed without question. But beneath that order, something was missing: emotional freedom. The space to say no without fear. The safety to cry without being shamed. The right to be seen, not just managed. In many authoritarian households, love is expressed through control. It's not that the parent doesn't care. They care deeply, but in a way that often confuses authority with affection. The child becomes a project, a reflection, a legacy. They are told who to be, what to feel, and when to speak. And the more compliant they are, the more they are praised. The rebellion doesn't come as a teenager's tantrum. It comes later, in an adulthood, in silence. This is the rebellion of the soul. When the adult child realizes that their life was never truly theirs, that every decision, college, career, marriage was filtered through the lens of parental approval, that their identity was molded, not discovered, and that freedom, for them, isn't about dramatic fights. It's about absence. It's about taking space, finally, to breathe. Carl Jung warned that what we repress will always return, but it won't look the same. For children raised under emotional dictatorship, that return often comes as detachment. They become distant not because they stopped loving, but because they were never taught how to love without obedience. Their boundaries were never modeled, only violated, so they learn to protect themselves through distance, through control of their own space, their own emotions, and eventually their own story. For the aging parent, this is often heartbreaking and confusing. I gave them everything, they say. I was strict, but it was for their good. And maybe it was. But here is the truth that hurts. Love without freedom feels like prison. And even the most well-meaning parent can become a warden if the child never felt safe enough to be fully themselves. So when that child grows up and chooses distance, it isn't always about cruelty. It's about recovery. It's about claiming something they never had: a life that feels authentic, unsupervised, unapproved. And for that wound to ever close, someone must say what was never said. Not, I did everything for you, but did I ever make room for you to be you? Because sometimes, the only way a child can reclaim their identity is by walking far enough away that they can finally hear their own voice. When love was transactional, not emotional. Some children don't remember being hugged. Not because it never happened, but because it never meant safety. It meant something was expected afterward. A good grade. A perfect behavior. A chore done without question. They were praised, but only when they performed. They were noticed, but only when they pleased. In these homes, love was not a river. It was a currency. And the child learned early that affection had a cost. That warmth had to be earned. That failure meant silence, withdrawal, or cold disappointment. They weren't punished violently, but the absence of emotional warmth felt like punishment just the same. As adults, these children often carry a strange guilt. They want to love their parents, but they don't know how. Because for years, love wasn't love, it was a transaction. And now, as their parents age and seek closeness, the child feels conflicted. Do they really want me, or do they want something from me? This is the lingering wound of conditional love. It doesn't scream. It seeps. It clouds every interaction with suspicion. And worse, it numbs the heart. Because when you've spent a lifetime auditioning for approval, you eventually forget what real connection feels like. You don't reject your parents out of malice. You just never learned how to be with them without performing. Developmental psychology calls this anxious avoidant bonding. The child is both drawn to and afraid of closeness. They long to be accepted, but brace for rejection. So they manage relationships from a distance. Safe, controlled, calculated. And when their aging parent, who may have softened with time, reaches out with vulnerability, the adult child isn't able to receive it. Not because they're cold, but because they're still unsure if the offer is genuine. The tragedy is this: both parent and child may desperately want connection. But they're speaking different languages. One says, "I did everything for you." The other asks, "Did you ever just sit with me, not as a teacher, not as a critic, but as a parent who sees me?" And when that question remains unanswered, distance becomes the only fluency left. Carl Rogers, the humanistic psychologist, believed that the core of healing is unconditional positive regard, to be seen and accepted without needing to earn it. But most children raised on performance never tasted that. So when their parents grow old and finally say, "I love you," it feels too late. Or worse, it feels like another transaction. So the child withdraws. Not out of revenge, but out of fatigue, out of confusion, out of never knowing what love really meant in that house. And sometimes, the saddest distance is not miles, but years of not being emotionally safe, in a place you were supposed to call home. Burnout and emotional fatigue in the sandwich generation. Sometimes, abandonment is not driven by wounds from the past. Sometimes, it comes from the weight of the present, a quiet exhaustion that builds over years, until the adult child, caught between raising their own kids and caring for aging parents, simply runs out of emotional oxygen. This is the reality of the sandwich generation. People in their 30s, 40s, and 50s who are pulled in opposite directions by children who need constant nurturing and by parents who are growing increasingly dependent. Add to that the demands of work, bills, marriage, and survival, and you get a person stretched so thin they begin to vanish even from themselves. In this space of chronic overwhelm, something happens. The brain shifts into survival mode. Emotions are dulled. Compassion becomes a limited resource, and caregiving, which should come from love, begins to feel like a burden, especially when the relationship with the parent has always been complicated. Imagine this: a daughter who wakes up early to pack lunch for her kids, works 8 hours at a stressful job, checks in on her mother who criticizes how little she visits, then comes home to cook, clean, and collapse. Or a son who juggles a mortgage, a troubled teenager, and a father who calls 3 times a day with complaints but never gratitude. Over time, even the kindest heart grows numb. This isn't cruelty. It's emotional burnout, a state where the nervous system shuts down its capacity for empathy because it's already overcommitted. And if the emotional bond with the parent was never strong to begin with, caregiving becomes a duty stripped of connection. It's no longer "I want to help you," it's "I have to help you." And when that burden becomes too heavy, some children choose silence not to hurt, but to survive. Modern life has only made this worse. In many cultures, extended family support systems have broken down. Communities are fragmented. Time is scarce. And the emotional bandwidth to care for everyone is shrinking. The adult child, overwhelmed and unsupported, begins to retreat not because they lack love, but because they lack capacity. Psychologist Gabor Maté once said, "The difference between helping and enabling is boundaries." And for many in the sandwich generation, setting a boundary with a demanding parent is the only way to protect their own sanity. But for the parent, that boundary can feel like abandonment, especially if they come from a time when sacrifice was expected and silence was love. So what appears on the outside as neglect is often a quiet cry for help. Not, "I don't care about you," but "I don't know how to care for everyone without losing myself." In this part of the story, abandonment isn't about broken bonds. It's about broken balance. And the healing must begin with recognizing that even love has limits, and that rest, too, is a form of care. the tragedy of parents who can't accept aging. Some people are not abandoned because they are no longer loved. They are abandoned because they never learned how to grow old with grace. Because they never let go of the throne even when the kingdom changed hands. Aging is more than a biological process. It is a psychological reckoning. It demands humility, softness, and the courage to surrender roles we once clung to. But not everyone is ready. Many parents, when faced with declining strength or fading relevance, respond not with openness, but with resistance. They double down on control. They criticize, manipulate, guilt, or demand desperate to feel important again. And their children, who once endured this behavior in silence, now have a choice: to stay close and suffocate, or to step back and breathe. Developmental psychologist Erik Erikson called the final stage of life integrity versus despair. This is the task of the aging psyche: to reflect, to accept, and to find peace in what was. But when this task is avoided, what replaces it is bitterness, blame, a refusal to admit vulnerability. The aging parent becomes emotionally rigid, clinging to the authority they once had, expecting the same obedience from adult children that they demanded from toddlers. This creates a tragic reversal. Instead of deepening connection in old age, the parent becomes harder to love, not because they are old, but because they refuse to be anything other than powerful. And love, real love, can't grow in a space where power dominates. Children, especially those who have worked hard to heal, to build their own families, and to break cycles of dysfunction, are often left confused. How do I care for someone who still sees me as a child? Who doesn't respect my boundaries? Who demands everything but gives no softness in return? Eventually, many stop trying. They do the basics. They send money. They arrange care. But emotionally, they step away, not because they want to, but because there is no room for them to exist as equals. What's most painful is that this dynamic could be different. Old age, when met with humility, becomes a doorway to the most beautiful kind of connection, the kind built not on authority, but on vulnerability. A parent who says, "I'm scared, I need you," often finds more warmth than one who says, "You owe me." But few are taught how to grow old emotionally. We prepare for retirement, not for surrender. We teach strength, not softness. And so many elders die surrounded by walls they built themselves, fortresses of pride, defended by silence, empty of love. The truth is, aging well is not about staying strong. It's about becoming open. It's about letting your children see your humanity. And sometimes, it's about saying the words you once thought made you weak. I need you, not as my child, but as my equal. The Western value shift freedom over obligation. There was a time when caring for aging parents wasn't a question. It was simply what you did. A sacred duty, unquestioned, passed down through generations. Children became caretakers because that's what family meant: continuity, sacrifice, obligation. But something changed. Slowly, quietly, over the course of decades. Especially in the West, the meaning of family shifted. The idea of duty was replaced by choice. And in that shift, something beautiful was gained, but something sacred was lost. We now live in a culture that prizes autonomy above all. Individual fulfillment, personal growth, emotional boundaries. These aren't selfish goals. They are, in many ways, essential to mental health. But when these values collide with aging parents who expect unconditional support, the result is often rupture. Not because love has vanished, but because the language of love has changed. In Western societies, adulthood is defined by separation. You leave home. You build your own life. You make your own choices. And often, that life is built on hard-won emotional independence, especially for those who grew up in households where freedom was denied. So when an elderly parent reappears with demands, expectations, or guilt, the adult child may feel cornered. Not because they don't care, but because they've spent years learning how to breathe again. In collectivist cultures, the family is the center. Your identity is tied to your role within the group. But in individualist cultures, the self becomes the center. And when your sense of self has been shaped around emotional survival, the call to return to a parent who once hurt or controlled you doesn't feel like love, it feels like regression. Sociologist Zygmunt Bauman once said that in modern life, relationships are liquid. They must adapt, flow, change form, or they dissolve. The parent-child relationship is no exception. What once stood on the foundation of obligation now requires something more fragile, more human, emotional reciprocity. If a parent never built that connection, if the relationship was maintained only by duty, it often can't survive the erosion of time. So when an elderly mother says, "But I raised you," and her daughter responds, "Yes, but I don't feel safe with you," this isn't rebellion. It's the consequence of a deeper cultural shift. One where presence must be earned, not assumed. Where love is not owed, it must be felt. This doesn't mean adult children are always right, nor does it excuse abandonment. But it does explain why the old script "they're your parents, you owe them" no longer works. In the modern psyche, being related is not enough. What matters is being real. And that's the challenge of our age, to reimagine family not as a contract of debt, but as a living connection. One built on choice, empathy, and above all, the willingness to evolve. The cost of unspoken sacrifices. There is a certain kind of parent who gave everything. The one who worked double shifts, who skipped meals so their children could eat, who paid for school by selling jewelry, who stayed in a loveless marriage for the sake of the family. And yet, as they grow old, they find themselves alone, forgotten by the very people they sacrificed for. And they don't understand why. "I gave them everything," they whisper. "How can they leave me like this?" It's a haunting question, and one that echoes in empty homes, in birthday cards never sent, in quiet hospital rooms where no one visits. But here's the brutal truth: sacrifice without expression is invisible. Many parents gave their children the world, but in silence. They never said, "I'm proud of you." They never said, "I love you," without it being followed by advice, correction, or critique. Their love was real but locked away, buried beneath duty. And children, especially young ones, don't speak the language of sacrifice. They speak the language of warmth, of presence, of tenderness. So while the parent believes they gave everything, the child often remembers emotional coldness, distance, rules, expectations. And over time, they form a painful belief: I was never really loved. I was managed. I was supported. But I wasn't seen. This is the tragic gap between intention and perception. The parent thinks, "I proved my love by what I did." But the child feels, "I never heard it. I never felt it." Family therapist Virginia Satir once said, "We need 4 hugs a day for survival, 8 for maintenance, and 12 for growth." But in many homes, affection was rationed. Vulnerability was avoided. Emotions were considered weakness. And now, decades later, the bill has arrived, and it's devastating. Because here's the cost of unspoken love: there are no emotional memories to return to. Nothing warm to anchor the child when the parent is frail. No moment of laughter, of safety, of gentleness to reach for. So the child, even if they want to care, often feels empty, detached, numb, and the parent feels betrayed. "I gave them my life." Yes, but love, to be remembered, must be translated into gestures, into words, into moments that linger. Silent sacrifice may win admiration, but it rarely wins closeness. So the child walks away, not because they're ungrateful, but because the love they needed was never shaped into a form they could carry. This is the cost of a generation that believed showing up and paying the bills was enough. That silence was strength. That toughness was love. But children grow up, and what they carry with them is not just what you did, it's how you made them feel. Healing the fracture: what to do if this is your story. Maybe you're the parent who sits in silence, wondering why the call stopped, why the visits feel like formalities, why your child, once so close, now feels like a stranger. Or maybe you're the child grown now, tired, numb, who doesn't know how to go back, because going back feels like betrayal to the self you fought so hard to become. If this is your story, know this first: you are not alone. Millions live in this quiet heartbreak, the long ache between what family should be and what it became, the space where love was meant to grow but somehow withered. And yet, not all is lost. Healing doesn't begin with obligation. It begins with honesty, with naming what was never named. If you're a parent who senses your child pulling away, don't lead with guilt. Lead with vulnerability. Don't say, "After all I did for you." Say, "I know I made mistakes. I want to understand you better." Say, "I miss you." Not because I need help, but because I miss being close to you. That one sentence, spoken without defense, can open a door that's been locked for years. And if you're the child, feeling guilty for stepping away or confused by the distance, start with curiosity, not blame. Ask yourself, what am I really protecting myself from? Was it control? Coldness? Neglect? And then ask, has anything changed? Because sometimes people soften. Parents evolve. Time, in its cruel way, humbles us all. But no one can reach you through silence. You must decide, is there still a thread worth following? For both of you, therapy can help. A letter can help. Even a single, honest conversation, one that doesn't try to fix the past, but simply names it, can change everything. Psychologist Esther Perel once said, "The quality of your life ultimately depends on the quality of your relationships." And there is no relationship more layered, more loaded, more tender than the one between parent and child. So what does healing look like? It might not be dramatic. It might not involve full reconciliation. Sometimes it's simply understanding each other enough to let go of the resentment. Sometimes it's creating a new kind of relationship, one with clearer boundaries, deeper respect, fewer expectations. And sometimes, if reconnection isn't possible, healing means making peace with distance, not with bitterness, but with grace. Knowing that you've grieved, that you've tried, that you've seen the story for what it is, and chosen to carry forward what's useful and release what is not. Because even broken families carry seeds of love. And while some never bloom, others simply need the right season. So if this pain belongs to you, hold it gently. Speak what was never spoken. And whether you stay, return, or walk away, do it consciously. Not as a reaction, but as a choice. Love is not always loud, but it is never too late to listen.